You see, doing research in a small country with a very limited budget, my philosophy was that one should try to find out topics that are not being pursued by the major groups throughout the world. We cannot compete with them. It's obvious that we should try to find, by studying the literature, by thinking about important projects, we should follow research pathways that were not being followed by major groups. Nobody was working on cannabinoid chemistry. So we thought at that time that this is a project worth following.
In 1986, in the introduction to cannabinoids as therapeutic agents, after summarizing the knowledge about the historical use of cannabis, you leave us with a question. Are we missing something? What is that thing?
We knew a lot about the plant cannabinoids. They had been evaluated in the test tube. They had been evaluated in animals, to a certain extent in human patients, but nothing was known at that time about the mechanism. A group in the US, Professor Aline Howlett, she was a young researcher at that time in St. Louis.
I really didn't know very much at all about marijuana or cannabinoids. That wasn't my area of expertise. In the United States, we need DEA approval to get cannabinoid drugs for research. So I got through the approval. I got some delta-9 THC and did these studies and found some very interesting things.
Dr. Howlett found in the brain a specific receptor for THC. It was named the CB1 receptor, cannabinoid receptor number 1.
Now that was a major discovery in the mid-80s. So here we had, for the first time, an indication that THC acts on a receptor.
So that was the first momentous discovery. And then once it was discovered that there are receptors, then the next obvious question is, why are there receptors in the human brain for a smoke substance? How did God know that his creations will smoke marijuana?
Receptors are made for compounds that we produce, not because there is a plant out there.
And the answer obviously was that it's not for marijuana. There are some compounds in the body itself which mimic marijuana.
So we went ahead looking for endogenous compounds. In my lab, there were 3 collaborators who contributed a lot in this research.
My name exactly is Lumír Ondřej Hanuš. I went for socialism in Czechoslovakia. Professor Meshulam invited me. I'm here already 23 years.
23?
I came just for 1 year and it's a little bit extended. 1 year, it was not enough for research. He already had here postdoc Bill Devane, Dr. Bill Devane.
In the States, I go by Bill. In Ireland, I go by Will.
Okay, run over.
He used to come late in the afternoon and work throughout the night. And Aviva Breuer, she worked with me in the lab for about 30 years. She still works with me in the lab. She used to come early in the morning. So sometimes they would meet here. If it was 5 o'clock in the morning, she would come in and he was just about to leave.
In 3.5 years, we never had a lab meeting.
Looking for the endogenous cannabinoid, a lot of brains were involved, not only brains of the researchers.
Well, we initially worked on brains of pigs. It is generally accepted that the organs of pigs and the organs of humans are somewhat closely related. And probably pigs and humans are also somehow closely related. Well, I'm not sure that the pigs will be very happy to be related to humans, but that's something else. So we wanted to work on pig brains.
I got the brain and just made some fractions and put it over a sand column and separated a few fractions and tested them for how they bound to the receptor. And I thought, oh, it won't take long, you know?
I came just for 1 year, but after 1 year, with Bill, still we didn't have pure compound. So we asked Professor Meshulam to extend. Shalom.
A few other labs were already looking for compounds.
He thought we might be scooped by some other lab.
But we told him, just try it with us. We are very close.
And after about 2 years, we found in extremely low amounts
It was only like a few droplets in the end of a little test tube.
a compound in the brain which acts on these receptors.
And of course, as with every important discovery, no single lab usually has all the expertise. So Rafi was such a well-known figure in the field that he was able to put together a team of outstanding colleagues, including Roger Pertwee,
I'm professor of neuropharmacology at the University of Aberdeen.
considered one of the top experts in cannabinoid receptor research.
But they then needed to see whether it behaved like we expect a cannabinoid to behave. So we just developed a new assay for doing that. So they sent me some anandamide, and we were able to show in our laboratory that it did behave like we would expect a cannabinoid receptor agonist to behave. We've had other collaborations since then, but that was very much the most exciting one.
We hadn't figured out the name of it yet, though.
The chemical name is arachidonoyl ethanolamine. We could have left it at that. We thought that maybe it has to do with mood, emotions, things of that sort, and therefore we thought, well, if it causes some kind of changes in emotion, maybe it causes happiness.
If you smoke marijuana, it gives you a certain bliss. So the natural compound also is responsible for that same type of a bliss, an internal bliss that you have, you know?
We looked for a good name, and although some people do not agree with me, but in Hebrew there are not too many names for happiness. For sorrow you can find a lot of names, but for happiness, not for extreme happiness. We've looked into Assyrian things, but the Assyrian things are more complicated. They call cannabis with apparently a lot of THC, they call it ganzigunu. Well, call the compound ganzigunu was too complicated. So we decided we'll go to something else.
I remember actually discussing the naming of this. I think it was Bill Devane who came up with the name. Is that right?
Right.
Rafi Meshulam and Roger Pertwee and myself were all sitting outside in the sun, overlooking a nice little river. And 2 years before, I said to Rafi, if I isolate this chemical, I get to name it, don't I?
Bill was interested in these Sanskrit stories, and he found that Ananda is bliss, delight.
People who know me know that I study Eastern philosophy, and I know lots of Sanskrit words, you know?
Ananda means in Sanskrit supreme joy.
Professor Meshulam said, you know, it can be a good, it will be a part just on chemical nature of this compound, and because it's ethanol amide. So we did Ananda and amide, so it's anandamide.
Even in the print form of a dictionary, the Collins Unabridged English Dictionary, and I bought one for my sister and gave it to her, and it's in the dictionary. Anandamide. Anandamide. Yeah.
They made this discovery and published in this landmark paper, and its importance is illustrated very well by the fact that it's one of the very few papers in the biomedical literature that has been cited over 2,000 times since its publication.
They even don't cite it anymore because it's considered such a well-known thing, an obvious thing, that they don't even cite our work anymore. They mention anandamide does A and B and C. It turned out that there is a whole system in the body which is involved around anandamide, and this in many respects parallels important systems that the body relies upon them. And this system is called now the endocannabinoid system, and a huge number of researchers are involved in investigating this system from many aspects.
I'm a full professor of biochemistry.
The basis of my work was to understand how the nervous system works.
I usually go by Dr. Mary Abu.
The CB2 receptor is we're trying to discover how the world works, or in our case, how cannabinoids work and how the brain works.
Are there additional receptors? We know CB1, CB2 are receptors.
And you see a difference between the oral administration versus the smoked form, which is a very similar.
In this model, we found that activation of CB2 was effective. A compound which we haven't managed to isolate yet, but we strongly believe exists.
The endocannabinoid system is complex, it's very challenging.
If the animal, during the timeout period, is still pressing the lever, is because he has lost the control.
It's just perhaps not easy to describe, actually, how...
So in 1995, you had an idea of testing THC on children.
It has been known for many years that cannabis can lower the effects of anti-cancer drugs. Anti-cancer drugs, many of them, cause terrible side effects. And in children, unfortunately, children get cancer as well. Children vomit and want to vomit, have nausea. They're really in a bad shape. And they cry all the time, and their parents are in a bad shape. Luckily, most of the children can be cured of the cancer, but the treatment is absolutely difficult. We wanted to do a clinical trial in children. We did that with Professor Aya Avramov. She was head of the Department of Pediatric Oncology in one of the Jerusalem hospitals. And we did a major study with THC given in oily drops under the tongue of children. Obviously, children cannot smoke. We had children that were not even 1 year old. She dropped THC in olive oil under the tongue 2 or 3 times a day, small doses, during the anti-cancer treatment. At the beginning, we wanted to do a double-blind study. Some of the children got the THC, some other children got only the olive oil. After a week, she told me, I'm not going ahead with that. I know exactly who is getting the THC. I know exactly who is not getting it. There was a complete separation. Those that didn't get it continued to vomit. So she went ahead doing an open study, and she gave THC, pure THC, under the tongue about 400 times, which means that those that were involved in the experiment got it every time they were treated with whatever they were being treated. And at the end, we saw that we had complete block of vomiting, complete block of nausea by small amount of THC, which did not cause any psychoactivity, nothing. So here we had a complete therapeutic effect. And we published that, and again, essentially nothing happened. Finito, that was it. It's still not being used in children.
And you think it's a good idea to use it for children?
Well, I believe it's an excellent idea because we help those children that suffer. But I have no influence on oncologists.
If there is a cancer patient who's got pain and that pain is not being controlled well by other kinds of drugs, they're on cancer chemotherapy, they're vomiting, I think it's unethical to withhold a drug from them that can be very useful to help them in their pain management and in their ability to cope with their disease.
In about 1999, he came up with a concept with Dr. Ben Shabbat of the entourage effect, the idea that there were many compounds, endogenous cannabinoids, some seemingly inactive on their own, but together they make this beautiful music. They create an entourage effect that greatly increases activity.
Rafi basically spoke to me about this entourage idea, and he made a very nice comparison, you know, like politicians, if they go alone to places, nobody pays them any importance. If they go accompanied by perhaps less active components, just the fact that the politician or the minister or the president is accompanied by many people makes it more important. So this is the entourage effect.
I feel that the same applies to the components of the cannabis plant itself. And so many of these are what are called minor cannabinoids, contribute to an overall effect that you cannot produce with a single molecule. This has been a key concept in what the work I've tried to do under his influence.
I was convinced that one should only test pure compounds with one target, whereas it's the combination sometimes of the compounds that can do the trick.
A very serious group of researchers has recently published a paper saying that the endocannabinoid system is involved in essentially all human diseases.
If you combine CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors, they cover most of the organism, at least in mammals.
We are mammals.
We are mammals.
Okay.
But when you talk of mammals, you talk of horses and dogs and mice and rats and rabbits and lions and...
We all share the endocannabinoid system.
I believe so. I believe so. And it has been demonstrated in many species.
Because now suddenly everyone has cannabis in their bodies, or everyone has a cannabinoid in their bodies, so it can't be bad.
These molecules that we all have are so critical from the birth to the death of each of us in health and disease.
He suggested that endocannabinoids in the milk of mothers actually may contribute to the hedonic effects of the milk. And it turned out to be almost true, actually. So he has a great vision. And then I know that he suggested to Itai Bab that he should look at the bone. Why would anybody in the world, actually, without preconception, look at bone development?
רגע. כמובן דש לדליה. We're going to my lab. We can go through the bigger entrance.
Or to the
small entrance here. My name is Professor Itai Bab. I am the director of the Bone Laboratory at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
We're going to see now the cannabinoids in bones?
Yes.
Okay. So you do have a laboratory here.
You've been here. We have discovered the skeletal endocannabinoid system. These are osteoclast cultures. Osteoclast. Osteoclasts are cells that break down bone.
Okay.
So she's analyzing the effect of cannabinoids on the number of osteoclasts. This is the growth engine, which is similar in mice and humans. You see here the brown cells, these are CB1 receptors, these are C receptors in the engine.
We've got a lot of research now going on because now we know there are CB1 and CB2 receptors in those kinds of cells that either help degrade the bone or help rebuild the bone. In this day and age, people are living, women beyond menopause, men well into old age, and we're going to have to think about how to preserve those bones so they can last another 40 years after menopause.
When a woman becomes pregnant, basically the body should get rid of the embryo because the embryo, to a certain extent, 50%, comes from a different organism from the father. The body doesn't do that. We don't know why the body doesn't do that. It's kind of a lowering of the immune system, certainly around the embryo. And it seems, it's quite possible, that the endocannabinoid system, in a wide sense of meaning, may be involved in prevention of this kind of immune effect, which is the basis of our life. I mean, obviously, if the embryo is kicked out, there's going to be no life on this planet.
The cannabinoid field was starting to really come online, and there was this big connection with endogenous cannabinoids and exogenous cannabinoids and pain. My PhD was in female reproductive pain. It's just really fun to be at this point of going, wow, we're actually, understanding some of the mechanism of why women basically have taken cannabis for thousands of years for reproductive pain.
I would consider myself still as a mouse geneticist and neurobiologist. So our approach is to make mutant animals. So almost every talk that you hear contains some data that were generated with the mice that we generated, that we made.
You get seniority if death you can't avoid. The lab was up to me. I chose cannabinoids. Heard it's a fun house where a little lab mouse can partake.
For several years, I was researching motor neuron disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and was able to show that THC was actually protective in a mouse model of ALS. The mice that were given THC lived a little longer and did a little better than the ones that did not get treated with THC. So that was really exciting work.
Can cannabis cure cancer?
Well, first of all, we know that THC lowers the effects of cancer treatment. But what you're asking is it an anti-cancer drug? And the answer is, I don't know. And the reason for that is silly. It has been tested in the test tube. THC has been tested, cannabidiol, crude cannabis has been tested in the test tube. And yes, in many cases, it blocks the development of cancer cells, yes. Professor Guzman is a major researcher in Spain. He has worked on the mechanisms through which cannabinoids act on cancer.
In our hands, classical cannabinoids are the ones that work best, by large, in inducing cell death in cancer cells.
THC comes from cannabis or comes from synthetic?
THC coming from cannabis. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it's THC, the real THC. Now we know that cannabinoids can exert anti-tumor actions in animals, not only in brain tumors, but in many different types of tumors. We know that cannabinoids act not only by inducing cell death through that specific mechanism called apoptosis, but we know that cannabinoids can tackle other processes of cancer cell growth, such as angiogenesis, metastasis, cell cycle, etc.
He even did a small clinical trial.
We did a trial with 9 volunteers that had a very malignant form of brain cancer, glioblastoma multiforme, and we observed some positive effects of cannabinoids in survival of the patients and also on tumor growth, based both on imaging techniques, magnetic resonance imaging, and also based on the measurement of some biomarkers of tumor progression.
Though we have done quite a lot in the field of cannabinoids and endocannabinoids, we have not done enough in clinical trials. This is something that has to be done. If this is not done, we will certainly miss a lot, and we will not be helping human patients. It should be done.
My name is Cristina Sanchez, and I work at Complutense University in Madrid, Spain. And I have been working for the last decade on the anti-tumor effects of cannabinoids. In the early 1960s, Rafi Meshulam from the Hebrew University in Israel characterized the main compound in marijuana producing the psychoactive effects that we all know. The cannabis plant has been known for millennia. After the discovery of this compound, that is called THC, it was pretty obvious that this compound had to be acting on the cells, on our organism, through a mechanism, through a molecular mechanism. And in the 1980s, two specific targets for THC were discovered, something that we call cannabinoid receptors. And after the discovery of the receptor, it was obvious that our body has to synthesize something that binds to these receptors. It was pretty obvious that was something endogenously produced by our own bodies that was acting through these receptors. And these compounds, these endogenously produced cannabinoids, were found a few years later, and it's what we call the endocannabinoids, because they are produced endogenously inside our bodies. These compounds, the endocannabinoids, together with the receptors and the enzymes that synthesize, that produce the endocannabinoids and that degrade the endocannabinoids, are what we call the endocannabinoid system. And we now know that the endocannabinoid system regulates a lot of biological function. Appetite, food intake, motor behavior, reproduction, and many, many other functions. And that's why the plant has such a wide therapeutic potential. We started working in this project 15 years ago, and it was basically by chance. We were working with astrocytes at that time, and we decided to change the model and work with astrocytoma cells, the tumoral cells. And we observed that when we treated these cells with cannabinoids, THC, the main psychoactive component of cannabis, it was killing the cells in our petri dishes. We were killing the cells. So we thought that we were facing some potential anti-tumoral responses. And then we decided to analyze these compounds in animal models of breast and brain tumors. The results we have obtained are telling us that cannabinoids may be useful for the treatment of breast cancer. We started to do experiments in animal models of glioblastoma, brain tumors, and we observed that cannabinoids were very potent in reducing tumor growth. Cells can die in different ways, and after cannabinoid treatment, they were dying in the clean way. They were committing suicide, which is something you really want when you have an anti-tumoral drug. One of the advantages of cannabinoids or cannabinoid-based medicines would be that they target specifically tumor cells. They do not have any toxic effect on normal, non-tumoral cells. And this is an advantage with respect of standard chemotherapy that target basically everything. When we started to see these anti-tumor and cell-killing effects on cancer cells, we decided to set aside our metabolic studies and to focus on cancer. I cannot understand why in the States cannabis is under Schedule 1, because it is pretty obvious, not only from our work, but from work from many other researchers, that the plant has a very wide therapeutic potential. We are in contact with doctors in Spain, oncologists, neuro-oncologists, and breast specialists that are willing to test these compounds in human patients. The plant, besides THC, produces cannabidiol. And this compound is very special because it is not psychoactive. It has been demonstrated that it's a very, very potent antioxidant. It protects the brain from stress and from damage, kills cancer cells, and when you combine it with THC, it produces synergistic effects, which means that the effect of THC is potentiated. At this point, we have enough preclinical evidence supporting the idea that cannabinoids may have anti-tumoral properties. We, as researchers, should explore in more depth and be willing to try in many different pathologies. Cannabis has an enormous therapeutic potential.
As the primary active constituent of the medicinal plant cannabis, also known as marijuana. Most people are familiar with the euphoric effects of this compound. After entering the bloodstream, this compound becomes available to individual cells in the brain. Delta-9 THC interacts with specific cell surface receptors. It is analogous to a key entering a lock. This triggers a reaction inside the cell. Unexpectedly, this reaction in normal cells is significantly different compared to the reaction in cancer cells. In cancer cells, these reactions lead to cell death. In normal cells, it doesn't. This surprising difference is likely due to two things: a greater number of receptors on the outside of the cancer cells, and a different type of reaction inside the cancer cells as compared to the normal cells.
Intriguing answers started appearing in the early 90s when researchers pinpointed receptors in the brain and the body that bind with the cannabinoids. Receptors can be described as locks on the surface of a cell, and when the correct key binds with the correct lock or receptor, it opens the door and delivers messages. Sometimes the message is that the body is feeling pain. Other times the message may be that there's an invader and the immune system must attack.
Scientists located two receptors, cannabinoid receptors, one called the CB1 receptor, mainly in the brain, and the other is the CB2 receptor, which is mainly in cells of the immune system.
The CB1 receptors are extremely abundant in the brain, but they're also found all over the body in the major organs, the heart, the liver, kidneys, and pancreas, because the CB2 receptor can act like a target for the cannabinoids. Once they bind with the receptor, they can tell the cancer cell to die.
So basically telling the cells to commit suicide, and that's what they do. And we demonstrated that that would be the mechanism by which the cannabinoids can kill the cancer, and therefore it can be used effectively as an anti-cancer agent.
Dr. Nagar-Katti and his researchers were able to eradicate almost 100% of the cancer in test tubes. But they were skeptical they would see similar results when they moved on to tumors in mice.
To our surprise, we found that almost 25 to 30% of the mice completely rejected the tumor. They were completely cured. And in addition, we found that the remaining mice also, there was a significant reduction in the volume or the size of the tumors as well.
The lab results have been so promising that Dr. Nagar-Katti is beginning clinical trials with leukemia patients.
At one point, somebody decided that it is worthwhile testing cannabis with relatively high doses of THC, I believe, in people that are Alzheimer or Alzheimer-like patients. They got it in their food, in the yogurt or whatever. some of them, I believe, not all of them, but some of them were in a better shape. Some of them started speaking, their eyes became brighter. In one case, an ex-writer started writing again. In another case, a woman said, "I feel fine," and went home. So it seems to be helping the symptoms of Alzheimer or senility. Alzheimer at the moment is a huge, huge problem, and there is very little that can be done for Alzheimer patients. So maybe if it is well researched in the future, we should know how to help these patients. We're dealing here with a population of millions, and this population will grow because in most countries, Western countries at least, the number of older people is growing all the time. We are lucky that cannabis is not toxic. People do not die from overdose of cannabis.
Most appropriately for a cannabinoid meeting, we're ending on a high, really, in the form of a talk by Rafi Meshulam, who's of course the father of modern cannabinoid research, no doubt about that.
Research. We're also joined by Stacy Gruber, Director Cognitive and Clinical Neuroimaging Care, Director Marijuana Investigations for Neuroscientific Discovery Program at McLean Hospital, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School.
Data from our MIND program, the first project is a large longitudinal observational study, the first of its kind, is really designed to assess very specifically the impact of medical marijuana on areas like cognitive performance, measures of brain structure and function, conventional medication use, and other variables in patients before they begin using medical marijuana, so we can determine if there's any change. We follow them for up to 2 years. In one study, our first study actually, we recently reported improvements in a number of areas, including cognitive performance, sleep, and mood between baseline and after 3 months of treatment. In addition, patients reported reductions in their use of conventional medications. Very importantly, a 42% reduction in the use of opiates. This echoes what we've seen from states that have fully legalized medical marijuana, where the number of opiate-related prescriptions has decreased.
It's around 2730 BC. Legendary Emperor Shen Nung, regarded as the father of Chinese medicine, is exploring the benefits of marijuana for everything from malaria to poor memory. Use soon spreads across the continent. Though even back then, overuse supposedly caused blindness, sexual problems, and hallucinations, or as they called it, seeing devils. Irish doctor William O'Shaughnessy introduced weed to England and America in 1840, treating seizures, nausea, and menstrual cramps. Queen Victoria's doctor prescribed weed for his patients, leading many to wonder if the Queen ever took a toke to ease the pain of her monthly cycles. Across the ocean blue, George Washington grew hemp, but it wasn't the kind that gets you high. Still, rumors persist he used it for toothaches. Remember, he ended up with wooden teeth. Soon, weed was in all sorts of medicines. A paste treated corns on the feet, cannabis cigarettes for asthma attacks, cough mixtures given to both adults and children. Books at the time listed dozens of medical uses for weed, but it didn't last. In the early 1900s, laws designed to crack down on heroin and cocaine began to target marijuana, and public hysteria grew. The campy 1936 film Reefer Madness popularized weed's negative image.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
Showing stoned teens attempting to rape and kill, going insane, and committing suicide. Soon, marijuana possession and distribution were illegal, and in 1970, marijuana was classified as a Schedule I drug, with a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use.
So now that you know your history, let's get into the present right now. One of the most exciting things happening in the whole of cannabis and medical cannabis is the new UCLA Medical Cannabis Research Center, and its director is Dr. Jeffrey Chen. Let's go and catch up with him.
THC when given in combination with THC.
What do you see as the sort of therapeutic potential for the endocannabinoid system?
What we're actually finding is that in an incredibly wide variety of pathologic states, that the dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system is implicated. So if you're taking a look at CNS diseases, so certain neurodegenerative diseases, we're finding that the endocannabinoid system could be a therapeutic target, all the way from neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's to mood disorders like depression or anxiety to even schizophrenia. You're finding that it looks like low levels of anandamide might actually be contributing to schizophrenia. And in fact, when you it appears that there's one human study where they actually gave CBD and it found that it was actually able to treat the psychosis of schizophrenia, and they believe that the mechanism is the CBD is boosting anandamide levels. We're also finding that the endocannabinoid system could be a therapeutic target for cardiovascular disorders, liver diseases, inflammatory bowel disorders, all the way to being implicated in obesity and diabetes, implicated in certain bone disorders like osteoporosis, and implicated in cancer as well as autoimmune disorders. And so you can see that targeting endocannabinoid system, it's a wide new area for drug development. And it's interesting that right now we don't really have many drugs that target the endocannabinoid system. Like we said, we have Marinol and we have Sativex. And actually there was a drug that was targeting the endocannabinoid system called rimonabant. And it was designed to actually block the CB1 receptor, because the CB1 receptor, when stimulated, increases appetite and fat storage. And so it was designed to block the CB1 receptor, and it did work, right? It decreased appetite and it led to weight loss, but it was pulled from the market because it found that it also significantly increased rates of depression and suicide. So this is a very complicated system, and we're actively trying to do targeted drug development, but we have to be very careful about how we approach it, as evidenced by the kind of case of rimonabant.
So Doc, tell us a little bit about your journey to find yourself here as a practicing physician to working with medical cannabis every day.
I'm a clinical professor of medicine and rheumatology at both Cedars-Sinai and UCLA. But I'm also in private practice in rheumatology, and I see patients in my own practice. My patients are often patients who are in chronic pain, and they have an impaired quality of life due to their pain, and I want to do whatever I can to reduce their pain. And we have some standard allopathic medicines that we use, but sometimes they're sensitive and can't take them, or they don't work. And they come back to me as a court of last resort. What do I do? And I began to realize that there's another pain pathway that we can use, and that's cannabis, which may affect their perception or reaction to the pain as well. And I also realize, as somebody who uses functional medicine, that these same patients who are in pain often have nausea and sleep disturbance, and actually cannabis has effects on multiple systems. So we have a medication that may help them manage their pain, but may also affect multiple other systems. So I began to get interested in this. I actually was then asked by a national specialty organization to give a national talk, and I actually visited dispensaries, collective growers, and in the field, and learned a lot about the whole process as well, and then began to use it more widely in my practice. Then it also led to my interest in the preclinical work, and we've heard in this program from Rafi Meshulam, there's some great work at Hebrew University suggesting possible applicability in bone. When I see my patients who come into me who are on opioids, then I start talking with them about the fact that there is a condition called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, where with time they will need higher and higher doses of opioids, since there is good data to suggest that the opioid receptor gets downregulated. And so I like to use cannabis in those patients to help them taper down on their opioids, which I think is extremely important. And then it improves not only their opioid needs, but actually often improves their functionality.
What are some of the issues that you've seen that would make you think cannabis is going to be a good fit for them?
Well, first of all, remember, Jim, that I'm a rheumatologist. Okay, so as a rheumatologist who's treating people in pain, first of all, pain most, but as I mentioned earlier, I might be seeing some sleep problems, fitful non-restorative sleep, some nausea. Those are the top ones I see, but certainly also it has effects on muscle spasticity, which I can see in some of my patients. Certainly some of my patients have mentioned their effects on glaucoma as well, and generally it can be used for a variety of other conditions beyond those. It's been used widely in HIV and in cancer, and also in inflammatory bowel disease now, some signals. I'm certainly very intrigued by some of the newer, really exciting control data in pediatric populations, particularly in children who had seizures nonstop that was resistant to other therapies, that we can stop or reduce the frequency of seizures. And now we're seeing some other signals in patients who are children who've got a blood cancer, where we wipe out their bone marrow, give them a donor bone marrow, but occasionally the donor bone marrow actually attacks the child. And that's called graft versus host. And there's some signals that are now leading to formal clinical trials that it looks like that can slow down, prevent, or treat this illness, graft versus host, which can be fatal.
So Doc, one question that's come up a lot. What are terpenes and why are they relevant to medical cannabis?
Well, terpenes are one part. There's several hundred compounds in cannabis. Certainly we are all familiar with CBD and THC, and people are less familiar with terpenes. Terpenes are fragrant oils that impart some smell and taste, so some people may notice when they taste an oil, it doesn't taste so good. That's often usually the terpene. But the terpene may become important too. It can interact. There's something called entourage effect, where you get the whole plant works together, so terpenes can help. They might, for example, in some terpenes help the cannabis cross the blood-brain barrier. So they're actually an important part of the equation as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the entourage effect and what it is?
The entourage effect talks to whole plant medicine. And what we've learned is some of the compounds in cannabis that we're most familiar with, such as CBD or THC, actually may have more efficacy if they're combined together or with other compounds in a plant. So if there's an additive effect when you add more compounds together. Remember, there's several hundred compounds in the plant.
You know, what would you say are the advantages of using a non-allopathic strategy, like you said, like using something like cannabis in practice?
Well, I use the cannabis in practice for several reasons. First of all, I'm trying to achieve better pain and total body management, not only of the pain, but of other associated symptoms we talked about, like sleep. I also use it because I often see patients in pain who are already on opioids. And we all know that opioids have their limitations. We're all aware of the opioid epidemic. We're all aware that with time and increasing doses, you get something called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, where you downregulate all the opioid receptors and it stops working. And the patients think they got to keep increasing the dose, but then that leads to significant risk. So when I see patients on opioids, one of the first questions I have is to start talking with them. Can we use cannabis to help lower your opioid dose? And I think that's an important part of a dialogue that I have with my patients as well.
When you go to these rheumatology conferences or otherwise, do you see other rheumatologists who are interested in this conversation?
My peers generally don't know very much about it at this point. They hear from patients that it might be useful, and they'd like to certainly learn a lot more about it. And I think we've heard earlier in this program today from Jeff Chen on our efforts through UCLA to help educate physicians. I think some physicians at this point are reluctant to discuss it, perhaps because they don't know what to say to their patients. And others are hesitant to use it because of their concerns. And I think this raises some concerns on the part of patients. Do patients tell the physician that they're taking cannabis or not? Is there a risk of losing that doctor who seems really good? I myself discuss it. So my patients with pain management, I'm going to be open to their using cannabis while they're using their opioids, because I'm going to say, let's use it to help reduce your opioid dose. It's not here we're using it to help reduce the opioids. That's my target.
So, Doc, can you tell us a little bit about some of the health risks and side effects that you see in working with your clinical practice with medical cannabis?
Well, I think the first thing I'm most concerned about is the fact that, as a physician, I'm not recommending for recreational use. So THC, as we know, is usually psychoactive. Many of my patients in chronic pain have secondary depression, anxiety, panic disorders. They're psychologically brittle. They've been through a lot. Pain can be really demoralizing. When I give them if I were to give them THC or a high THC content cannabis, many of them say, I've tried it, I really didn't feel very good. What happens is it can actually exacerbate some of their psychological problems in various ways. People who are chronic users can get a variety of problems, including cannabinoid-induced hyperemesis, which we've actually seen in the emergency rooms, people who are having nausea and vomiting nonstop after cannabis. So there certainly are definitely some risks, and of course, if one is inhaling it and you have underlying lung problem, it couldn't be detrimental. No data actually showing definitely cancer risk, but clearly could be irritating to the lungs. So I think the physician and the patient need to have a dialogue about the risks and benefits.
So, Doc, one of the things in our functional medicine community, we have a lot of practitioners who are working with patients that have chemical sensitivities or other things. What did you learn on your trip that could help to inform other practitioners to get the most out of medical cannabis?
Since I do fibromyalgia, one of the components of fibromyalgia chronic fatigue is multiple chemical sensitivity. They're so sensitive to light, sound, and smells. Well, they're extremely sensitive to chemical components as well. And so in my original journey, I actually did field trips to local dispensaries, collectives, growers, etc. And I learned, for example, that much of the cannabis that's grown indoors might need to be treated with pesticides, fungicides, or there could be mold, for example. So I think it's really important for the consumer, that is the patient, to ask, is the cannabis that they are going to consider putting in their body, has it been tested with a toxicology report? Some, for example, one collective I know holds it in escrow until the toxicology report is done, and if it's positive, they reject the crop and will not distribute it to their members. So I think this is really important. Some states actually, like Colorado, actually have laws at the moment which actually require some toxicology done.
So, Doc, maybe for our audience at home, you could take us through what are some of the most popular delivery mechanisms for medical cannabis, and which ones do you recommend for your patients?
Well, there's a variety of delivery mechanisms. Our patients are probably most familiar with smoking it, actually, as a joint or, for example, or through a vaporizer. But again, I mentioned, older patients or older adults, it could be irritating to some of them. Edibles are often considered, but edibles are tricky. You don't know when it's going to be absorbed. So you take an edible now, it's not necessarily going to have an immediate effect. It might be several hours down the road, and that's not giving you the immediate relief you want medically. Might be good for sleep, but it's not giving you that immediate relief. And will you be driving at that point? Will you be taking care of your kids? So, we tend to move on to other forms. The other problem with edibles, for example, is they tend to use the marijuana, but where the marijuana is actually dissolves in fatty-like compounds like butter. So the distribution of butter on a brownie sheet can be very different. So one corner might be relatively dry, have minimal cannabis content, and the other corner have double or triple. So there's a kind of irregularity here. We need some good marijuana bakers. But the other issue here is also it can be interesting. Simple edibles like gummy bears only have it on the inside. There are some edibles now that have an outside crystalline coating, so you get more immediate action, and then you get a delayed reaction. My preference is to move on to sublingual delivery, which could be a tincture or an oil, or a sublingual nasal spray, where the absorption is fairly rapid. I think it's all part of a functional medicine program. So again, getting back to my patient with chronic pain, to me it's a facilitator. If I can use a medication that lowers your pain threshold, My goal is to get you to exercise and be more physically active. So to me, I tell patients, I want you to use this so you're going to be more active. Once your pain levels start dropping a little bit, there's no excuse for you not going out and exercising and working, because at the end, the exercise is really what we're aiming for. The cannabis is, to me, it's the start, gets you to first base, but to get you to home plate, you're going to have to eat well. Your physician will go over your nutrition, your diet, but also a exercise program, which I regard as a prescription, not simply go out and exercise. I actually spend the time to talk to my patients about what we need to do in terms of their exercise.
So Doc, what are some recommendations that you'd have for other physicians who are thinking about recommending cannabis to their patients but haven't taken the leap?
I think the patient, as the consumer, and the physician need to be aware of first is the THC content, because it is psychoactive. And I've had patients who before they came to me, and no one had asked them about it, went ahead and tried some cannabis, which was very high THC content, and had a psychological adverse effect, which we discussed earlier. And they didn't really want to try it again. So I actually, when I work with patients, I'll either start with a pure CBD or more likely a low THC content. We say 20 to 1 or 25 to 1 CBD THC, or no more than 4 to 5% THC, so we get started. Now, admittedly, some of the studies like in HIV neuropathy have shown you have best effect at 1 to 1, but I think I don't start there, because I have to respect my patients and how they react to it, because we're dealing with multiple systems again that are affected by cannabis.
I know you're very passionate about bone health and bone disease. What are some of the bright sparks and green shoots in the area of bone health and medical cannabis?
Well, in this program, we're going to be hearing a little bit about from Rafi Meshulam at Hebrew University in Israel, and that group and others have looked at effects on bone, and there's some signals that for example, in rodents who undergo menopause, that we might be able to prevent or treat. And there are other signals in another disease, osteogenesis imperfecta, which is the brittle bone disease, where children or adults get multiple fractures. It might be of help. We don't know this. Studies are on the way. This is all preclinical, not yet in humans, but I think it shows great promise in another system. There are some specific receptors in bone.
Doc, I know you said that there were some issues with product labeling, and that's been something that you've seen on your travels. What are some of the issues that you've seen, and what could be a solution for that?
Having, as part of my journey, visited dispensaries and collectives, when I walked in, I was overwhelmed. And I think that the patient as consumer is also overwhelmed. It's kind of like the consumer in the candy store, except someone took off all the labels. You don't really know. There are all these names for these strains. You have to ask a lot of questions. Is this an indica strain? What is it? What percent THC? I think that we need more transparent labeling. I've seen some beginnings of that in other states such as Colorado, indicating percent THC content, but also we're not labeling potency. The cannabis that my generation of baby boomers smoked decades ago is weaker compared to the potent strains we now have. So I think we really need to have more open labeling and discussion so the consumer can choose better. And I think as a physician right now here in California, I can only recommend, I can't prescribe. So we really need to be able to have the consumer who walks into the dispensary collective be able to have a reasonable, intelligent conversation until we get to the point where labeling is more transparent.
So what would you say to other doctors who are sort of sitting on the fence, not willing to sort of jump in and start to use these tools?
Their task is to learn more about it. I think as physicians, we need to feel comfortable discussing with our patients. It's not surprising that I think many of the patients out there know more about medical cannabis use than do their physicians. So I think working with Jeff Chen, who we've heard earlier in this program, there's an effort here at UCLA to try to educate physicians and increase their awareness so they do feel comfortable in talking. And I think patients also really appreciate the fact they know their physician is working with them. And I think it's a dialogue and it's a conversation that can really have dramatic results in terms of decrease opioid use, improve functioning, and really help manage patients. medical cannabis is an important part of a physician's armamentarium, but we're going to need to use toxicology reports. We're going to need to standardize it. We're going to need to have better consumer labeling. Yes, I think it's a great start that here in California it will be available in January, but I think we need to work together to make it more consumer and physician friendly.
So hopefully that gave you a really good idea about how some physicians are using medical cannabis right now in private practice. But one of the biggest questions that we've got is we hear from people who don't live in America, don't live in California, don't live in Colorado, or have different licenses and certifications but want to get involved in the movement. And that's why we partnered with the Holistic Cannabis Academy. So this academy is a training program that was started by, well, co-founded by one of the original supporters of the Functional Forum. Laura Logano is a registered dietitian and a functional medicine nutritionist based in New Jersey, and she co-founded the Holistic Cannabis Academy to be able to empower more providers of all varieties to be able to get involved and take advantage of these natural compounds in a compliant and legal way. So we're going to hear a little bit more from Laura about the Holistic Academy and how you can get set up. So take it away.
The Holistic Cannabis Academy was developed specifically for progressive practitioners just like you. So my business partner Donna Shields and I both had personal experiences with cannabis. Donna is a breast cancer thriver, and I have a daughter with developmental delay. They both have had stunning results with cannabis. We wanted to share this story with our nutrition colleagues and functional medicine colleagues. There was an issue. Number one, cannabis, there's a lot of cannaphobia. Cannabis is federally illegal, but here's the deal. Cannabis has actually been approved across the country in more than half the states around the world. Our Canadian neighbors are going to approve it across the entire country for recreational use. I can assure you that cannabis is going to be legalized in this country, in the US, very soon. Are you ready for that? Nobody. Our nutrition colleagues, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, even herbalists, believe it or not, have not been educated about cannabis, or definitely not about the endocannabinoid system. So clearly there was a need for education, and really solid education, not just some information about the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoids in plants and how to upregulate the system. Do you know about that? But also about how to really integrate that into your practice. Not the typical pharma bandage approach. Okay, let's replace Ambien with cannabis. That's ridiculous. We need to be integrating other modalities to make sure that we're upregulating that endocannabinoid system in total. So people ask us who we're educating. Physicians, nurses, pharmacists, nutritionists, health coaches, all of those holistic practitioners like yogis, aromatherapists, herbalists. We're already educating them all around the US and the rest of the globe. The Holistic Cannabis Academy is the only online cannabis training program for the Functional Forum community because we're progressive and holistic, just like you. We hope that you will join us.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of the Functional Forum, whether you're watching at home or you're watching in one of our 500 communities around the world. We really hope that at the minimum this has been informative and we'll get some discussion going in your local community. At the maximum, maybe this changes the way that you practice medicine. You can see that we have a very different set of disease structures than 50 years ago. We have a lot more science on this area of the endocannabinoid system. We hope that this might stimulate a conversation about the future of medicine. Thanks so much for being part of our community. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be back next month with another Functional Forum. In the meantime, I'm your host, James Maskell, and we'll see you next time.